The fundamental misconception about the collapse of a great civilization is that it is the result of a single decisive blow, a singular event that brings the entire edifice crashing down in a cloud of dust and recrimination. If you're drawn to uncovering the hidden layers of history, to seeing the stories that textbooks often ignore, now is a good time to like this video and subscribe, because what follows will reveal the slow, creeping forces that truly brought empires to their knees. The reality is almost always a more insidious and complex process, a slow, creeping sickness that rots the foundations from within long before the final, dramatic tremor is ever felt. The grand, apocalyptic conflict that defined the twilight of the ancient world was not a sudden cataclysm, but a slow, grinding war of attrition, a final, murderous embrace between two titans who had for centuries defined the very concept of empire. This was not a struggle for a border or a province, it was a war for the world itself, a generational contest of ideologies, faiths, and imperial wills that would leave both combatants so utterly broken, so completely drained of blood and treasure that they would be left defenseless before a storm they could not have possibly imagined. We have been conditioned to see history as a series of rises and falls, of glorious ascents and tragic declines, but we often fail to appreciate the sheer scale of a mutual annihilation, the vacuum created when the two pillars holding up the known world crumble simultaneously. The story of how one of the most brilliant civilizations of antiquity was seemingly erased from existence does not begin with its final conquerors. It begins decades earlier, in the opulent palaces of the Sassanian capital of Ctesiphon, with a king whose ambition was as vast and as glittering as his treasury. His name was Khosrow II, and he would be the architect of his empire's greatest triumphs and its ultimate, irreversible doom. This is the story of the last great war of antiquity, a conflict of such unimaginable scale and ferocity that it bled the two most powerful empires on earth to the point of collapse, unknowingly setting the stage for the rise of a new faith from the desert that would sweep them both away and redraw the map of the world forever. This is the story of how the fire of ancient Persia was finally extinguished, a story of hubris, revenge, and the catastrophic birth of the medieval world. To comprehend the magnitude of the fall, one must first appreciate the dizzying heights for which the empire descended. The Sassanid Empire, or Ranshah, the dominion of the Aryans, was not merely a state, it was a civilization, a cosmos unto itself. For 4 centuries, it had stood as the equal and eternal rival to Rome and its Byzantine successor, a sophisticated, hierarchical, and profoundly ideological superpower. Its foundations had been solidified by the great reformer king, Khosrow I Anushirvan, the immortal soul, a ruler who had become the Persian archetype of the philosopher king. He had rationalized the tax system, reorganized the military into a professional standing army, and fostered an environment of intellectual ferment, welcoming scholars from the closed Platonic Academy of Athens and Christian Nestorians fleeing Byzantine persecution. The Sassanid state was a marvel of centralized administration, governed by a rigid caste system with the King of Kings, the Shahanshah, at its apex, a figure who was not merely a secular ruler, but the earthly regent of the supreme Zoroastrian deity, Ahura Mazda. Below him was a stratified society of priests, warriors, scribes, and commoners, a divinely ordained order that had ensured stability for generations. The heart of its power was Mesopotamia, the fertile crescent between the Tigris and Euphrates, whose intricate network of irrigation canals produced immense agricultural surpluses, funding the state and its vast armies. The capital, Ctesiphon, was the largest city in the world, a sprawling metropolis of palaces, fire temples, and bustling markets. Its centerpiece, the colossal vaulted arch of the Tarkasra, a monument to a dynasty that saw itself as the rightful heir to the ancient Achaemenid glories of Cyrus and Darius. The military bedrock of this empire was the legendary Savarin, the elite armored heavy cavalry drawn from the ranks of the nobility. These were the cataphracts, or kleboneri, oven men, warriors so completely encased in lamellar and mail armor that they were virtually impervious to conventional weaponry. Both rider and horse were armored, creating a terrifying juggernaut of steel that functioned as the ancient world's equivalent of a main battle tank, a thunderous avalanche of metal designed to shatter enemy formations through sheer shock and awe. Supported by legions of skilled horse archers and disciplined infantry, the Sassanid army was a formidable and balanced force that had fought the Romans to a standstill for centuries, a symbol of a power that believed itself to be eternal and unconquerable. This was the world that Khosrow II inherited, an empire at the zenith of its power and cultural richness, a society secure in its ancient faith and its position as one of the two great lights of the civilized world. It was a legacy of immense strength, but one that contained within it the seeds of a fatal arrogance, a belief that its foundations were so deep and its power so absolute that it could withstand any storm, even one of its own making. The grand tapestry of imperial decline is often woven with the threads of personal relationships and perceived betrayals, moments where the fate of millions turns on the actions of a few. The final, fatal chapter in the centuries-long struggle between Persia and Rome was ignited by just such a moment, an act of profound betrayal that provided a sacred pretext for a war of unprecedented ambition. The Sassanid King of Kings, Khosrow II, later styled Parviz, the victorious, owed his very throne to the Byzantine Emperor Maurice. Years earlier, in 590 CE, when young Khosrow was usurped by his own brilliant general Bahram Choban, he had made a desperate choice. Fleeing his homeland, he threw himself upon the mercy of his dynasty's ancient rival, the Roman Emperor in Constantinople. Maurice, in a stroke of brilliant geopolitical maneuvering, saw an opportunity not for conquest, but for a paradigm-shifting alliance. He provided Khosrow with the army and resources needed to reclaim his patrimony. In return, the restored Persian king ceded vast territories in Mesopotamia and Armenia, and, more importantly, accepted a subordinate role in the regional power structure. For over a decade, an unprecedented peace reigned. The two emperors maintained a close personal friendship, with Maurice even acting as the adoptive father to Khosrow's son. For a brief, shining moment, it seemed the centuries of bloody conflict had ended, with the Sassanid Empire now a junior partner, a virtual client state to its Roman counterpart. This subordinate status, however, was a source of deep and festering humiliation for the proud Persian aristocracy, the great noble houses who saw the concession of ancestral lands as a stain upon their honor. It likely chafed at Khosrow himself, a king who possessed a boundless ambition and a deep-seated belief in the supremacy of his own lineage and the Zoroastrian faith. The peace, built upon Persian humiliation, was a fragile and brittle one, waiting for a single sharp shock to shatter it into 1,000 pieces. That shock came in the year 602 CE. The Byzantine army, engaged in grueling campaigns on the Danube frontier, mutinied against Maurice. The rebellion was led by a brutish, low-born centurion named Phocas, who marched on Constantinople, captured the legitimate emperor, and in a display of shocking barbarity that horrified the civilized world, forced Maurice to watch the execution of his own 5 sons before he himself was beheaded. The news of his patrons, his friends, and his adoptive father's gruesome murder provided Khosrow II with the perfect casus belli, a pretext that was both a sacred duty and a golden opportunity. Declaring himself the avenger of Maurice, he rejected the legitimacy of the usurper Phocas and launched a full-scale invasion of the Byzantine Empire. This was to be no mere border skirmish for the reclamation of lost territory. This was framed as a holy war of restoration, a war of vengeance. And in Khosrow's increasingly grandiose vision, it was to be a war to finally, definitively, and permanently destroy the Roman state, to restore the Achaemenid dream of an empire stretching from the Hindu Kush to the shores of the Aegean, and to prove once and for all that the faith of Ahura Mazda was destined to triumph over the faith of the crucified god. The initial Sassanian offensive was met with a success so stunning and so rapid that it seemed to confirm the divine sanction of Khosrow's cause. This was not only a testament to the raw power of the Persian military machine, but also to the utter chaos that had engulfed the Byzantine Empire under the tyrannical and incompetent rule of the usurper Phocas. His reign of terror had alienated the aristocracy, purged the military command of its most experienced generals, and created deep schisms throughout the provinces. The Byzantine state was paralyzed, its capacity to resist crippled from the inside. The Persian armies, led by brilliant and experienced generals like Shah-Baraz, the boar of the empire, and Shahin Vamanzadegan, systematically dismantled the Byzantine defenses in the east. The great fortress city of Dara, a bastion that had for decades anchored the Roman frontier and was considered nearly impregnable, fell in 604 CE after a lengthy siege. From there, the Persian advance became relentless. They swept into Roman Mesopotamia and Armenia, reclaiming all the territories Khosrow had been forced to cede years earlier, erasing the shame of his previous treaty. The Byzantine armies sent to stop them were repeatedly outmaneuvered and annihilated, their commanders either incompetent appointees of Phocas or simply overwhelmed by the scale and ferocity of the Persian onslaught. The situation for the Byzantines grew so dire that it triggered another internal collapse, a recurring feature of the Roman state in times of extreme crisis. In 621 CE, a new rebellion, led by Heraclius the Elder, the Exarch of Africa, succeeded in overthrowing the hated Phocas. His son, also named Heraclius, sailed a fleet from Carthage to Constantinople, captured and personally executed the usurper, and was crowned emperor, inheriting a state that was not merely at war, but in the advanced stages of disintegration. Heraclius came to power facing a situation that seemed utterly hopeless. The treasury was empty. The army was a broken and demoralized rabble. The Balkans were being overrun by Avars and Slavs, and the Sassanian war machine was continuing its inexorable advance, a force that seemed less like an army and more like a force of nature, a divine scourge. From his magnificent palace in Ctesiphon, Khosrow Cyril rejected Heraclius's desperate pleas for peace, viewing the new emperor as just another usurper with no legitimate claim to the throne. For the Persian king, the war was no longer about avenging Maurice. That pretext had served its purpose. It was now about achieving the ancient Achaemenid dream, a Persian empire that stretched from the Hindu Kush to the shores of the Aegean and the banks of the Nile. It was a war of total conquest, a war to erase the Roman name from the map of the world. The war machine that Khosrow II unleashed upon the Byzantine world was the culmination of 4 centuries of Sassanian military evolution, a force perfected by the reforms of his grandfather, Khosrow II. At its core was the legendary heavy cavalry, the Savarin, composed of the elite Azadan nobility and the new class of state-funded Daquan knights. These were warriors trained from birth for a single purpose, to deliver a decisive, shattering charge that would obliterate any force that stood in its path. Clad head to toe in intricate suits of lamella, mail, and plate armor, with even their horses barded in protective steel, they were the most heavily armored troops of their time. Their primary weapon was the kontos, a long, heavy lance wielded with both hands, capable of punching through the shields and armor of Roman infantry formations. They were also armed with heavy swords, maces, and battle axes for the brutal close-quarters combat that followed a successful charge. The psychological impact of a Savarin charge was a weapon in itself, a thunderous, disciplined avalanche of metal and fury designed to shatter the enemy's morale before contact was even made. Supporting these armored behemoths were vast numbers of skilled horse archers drawn from lighter cavalry units. These archers were masters of Parthian tactics, capable of firing powerful composite bows with deadly accuracy while on the move. They would harass the enemy with swarms of arrows, luring them out of their defensive formations, creating openings for the heavy cavalry and covering the advance or retreat of their comrades. This combination of heavy shock cavalry and mobile missile platforms gave the Sassanian army a tactical flexibility that was difficult to counter. A 1-2 punch of ranged attrition followed by overwhelming shock. But the Sassanian military of the early 7th century was more than just a cavalry force. They had learned from centuries of warfare with Rome and had developed a highly sophisticated logistical corps and a formidable siege train. They were masters of siege warfare, capable of constructing elaborate siege towers, battering rams, and complex mining operations to reduce the most heavily fortified Byzantine cities. Their engineering prowess was legendary, allowing them to overcome defenses that had stood for centuries. Furthermore, Khosrow II's army was a truly imperial force. Its ranks were swelled by contingents from vassal states and allies, including the highly effective and ferocious infantry from the mountainous region of Dalam, and skilled Arab lances from the Lakhmid kingdom who served as scouts and skirmishers on the desert frontiers. This vast, multi-ethnic, and well-equipped force was organized for a long, grinding war of conquest. And in the first 2 decades of the conflict, it proved to be an almost unstoppable instrument of Khosrow II's will, a perfectly honed weapon of imperial ambition that would carve a path of destruction deep into the heart of the Roman world. As the new decade dawned, the Persian advance continued, gaining a terrifying and seemingly irreversible momentum. Heraclius, struggling to consolidate his rule, purged the remnants of Phocas's regime, and rebuild his shattered armies from scratch was powerless to stop the tide. The fall of Byzantine defenses was not a gradual erosion, but a catastrophic collapse. In 617 CE, the Sassanian general Shahin swept into Syria and captured the great metropolis of Antioch, one of the 3 most important cities in the Byzantine Empire, alongside Constantinople and Alexandria. Its fall was a devastating strategic and psychological blow, severing the land route to the vital southern provinces. The next year, Damascus, another key city of the Levant, fell. The Byzantine defense of the east, which had held firm for centuries against countless Persian incursions, had utterly disintegrated in a matter of a few years. The most devastating blow, however, a blow aimed not just at the body, but at the very soul of the Byzantine world, fell in 604 CE. The general Sherbaraz led his army south through Palestine and laid siege to the holy city of Jerusalem. After a bitter siege of 20 days, the city was taken by storm. What followed was a massacre that sent shockwaves of horror throughout Christendom. Christian sources, though likely exaggerating the numbers, claim that tens of thousands of the city's inhabitants were slaughtered. But the greatest act of desecration, an act of supreme psychological warfare, was the looting of the city's most sacred Christian relics from the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. The Sassanian soldiers carried off the Holy Sponge, the Holy Lance, and most precious of all, the true cross, the supposed physical remnant of the cross upon which Jesus was crucified. The true cross was not merely looted, it was carried off in triumph back to Sassanid, not just as war booty, but as a symbol of the ultimate victory of the Zoroastrian faith over Christianity. Khosrow II had achieved an unimaginable triumph. He had not only defeated the Roman armies, he had humiliated their God. The news of the fall and sack of Jerusalem and the capture of the true cross was received as a sign of the apocalypse across the Christian world. It was seen as a clear indication that God had abandoned the Byzantine Empire for its sins. The war was no longer just a geopolitical struggle for territory. It had become a holy war, a clash of civilizations and faiths, and it was a war that the Sassanids were decisively winning. The moral collapse of the Byzantine Empire seemed imminent, its people gripped by a profound despair, their faith shaken to its core. Khosrow II had proven that his cause was the righteous one, that the favor of the divine was with him, the avenger of Maurice and the restorer of Persian glory. The string of Sassanian victories had already been legendary, but the conquest that followed the fall of Jerusalem cemented the Sassanian Empire's position as the new undisputed master of the East, achieving a level of dominance that not even the Achaemenids had fully secured. In 619 CE, the brilliant general Sharbaraz achieved what no Persian commander since the Achaemenid Empire had managed. He invaded and conquered the province of Egypt. The loss of Egypt was a potentially fatal blow to the Byzantine state. Egypt was the empire's breadbasket, the primary source of the grain that fed the massive population of Constantinople. Its loss meant not only a catastrophic drop in state revenue, but also the very real threat of famine in the capital. For the first time in nearly 1,000 years since the conquests of Alexander the Great, a Persian army once again stood on the banks of the Nile, its authority extending over the ancient land of the pharaohs. The psychological and strategic implications were immense. The Byzantines had lost one of their oldest and richest provinces, the jewel of their eastern possessions. While Sharbaraz was securing Egypt, other Sassanian armies were pushing deep into Anatolia, the strategic heartland of the Byzantine Empire. They captured key cities like Ancyra, modern-day Ankara, and even reached Chalcedon, a city directly across the Bosphorus from Constantinople itself. From their camps on the Asian shore, Persian soldiers could gaze upon the glittering domes and impregnable walls of the Byzantine capital. The Roman Empire, the eternal rival, was reduced to a rump state, consisting of little more than the city of Constantinople, a few coastal strips of Anatolia, some islands, and its territories in North Africa and Italy. The Mediterranean, once a Roman lake, was now dominated by a resurgent Persian superpower. By 620 CE, the Sassanian Empire had reached its absolute territorial zenith. Khosrow II had succeeded beyond the wildest dreams of any of his predecessors. He had avenged his youthful humiliation. He had reclaimed every piece of contested territory. He had effectively recreated the borders of the ancient Achaemenid Empire of Darius and Xerxes. From his magnificent palaces at Dastagerd, surrounded by unimaginable wealth and luxury plundered from a dozen provinces, Khosrow II saw himself as the ruler of the world, the favored of the gods. His arrogance grew to legendary proportions. He styled himself as the universal king, and his sense of invincibility was absolute. He had broken the Roman Empire forever. He had captured its holy city, carried away its most sacred relic, and seized its richest provinces. The war was, in his mind, effectively over. All that remained was the final snuffing out of the flickering candle of Roman resistance in Constantinople. It was the darkest hour in the 1,000-year history of the Roman state. The empire was shattered, its armies defeated, its spirit broken. The situation was so desperate that Emperor Heraclius seriously considered abandoning Constantinople altogether and retreating to the city of Carthage in North Africa to regroup and try to salvage what was left of his empire. The very survival of the Roman Empire, and with it the fate of Christendom, hung by the thinnest of threads. But it is in such moments of ultimate desperation that figures of historical greatness are forged. Heraclius, pushed to the very brink of annihilation, was preparing to unleash a counterattack so daring, so brilliantly unconventional, and so utterly unexpected that it would not only reverse the course of the war, but would change the course of history itself. The Sassanian triumph, seemingly so total and so permanent, was built on a foundation of hubris, a fatal overextension that would soon be brutally exposed by an emperor with nothing left to lose. The Byzantine Emperor Heraclius, cornered in his capital and presiding over a shattered and bankrupt empire, spent the decade from 610 to 620 CE in a desperate struggle for mere survival. He had fended off internal plots, secured the city's food supply from his African provinces after the fall of Egypt, and begun the slow, arduous process of rebuilding the Byzantine army from the ground up. He understood that a conventional frontal assault to reclaim the lost provinces was impossible. The Sassanian armies were too numerous, too well entrenched, and his own resources were far too meager. He needed a new strategy, a bold, high-risk gamble that could strike at the very heart of the Sassanian war effort and shatter the myth of Khosrow II's invincibility. His plan was nothing short of genius, a complete paradigm shift in Roman military strategy. He would transform the war from a static defense of Byzantine territory into a highly mobile holy war of retribution, taking the fight deep into the enemy's own lands. To fund this desperate venture, Heraclius took a step that demonstrated the sheer gravity of the crisis. He forged a powerful pact with the Orthodox Church, led by the fiercely patriotic Patriarch Sergius. The Church, recognizing the existential threat posed by the Zoroastrian Persians, agreed to loan the state its vast accumulated wealth. Gold and silver plate, icons, and treasures from every church and monastery in the capital were gathered and melted down to mint new coins to pay for soldiers and equipment. This act did more than just fill the state's empty coffers. It fundamentally transformed the nature of the war. It was no longer an emperor's political struggle, it was now a crusade, a sacred mission blessed by the church to liberate Christian lands and, above all, to recover the stolen true cross. This religious framing was a masterstroke of propaganda, inspiring a new generation of soldiers with a fanatical devotion and a belief that they were fighting on the side of God himself. Banners were emblazoned with the image of Christ, and the army marched as soldiers of the faith. In the spring of 622 CE, on the day after Easter, Heraclius, leaving the defense of Constantinople in the capable hands of Patriarch Sergius and the general Bonus, sailed from the capital with his newly forged army. He did not sail towards Syria or Egypt to confront the main Persian forces directly. That would have been suicidal. Instead, he landed his army in Anatolia and marched into the mountains of the Caucasus. This was a brilliant and unexpected strategic move. He was placing his army on the Sassanian Empire's vulnerable northern flank, forcing the Persians to divert troops from their lucrative occupation of the rich southern provinces to deal with this new, unexpected threat. For several years, Heraclius conducted a series of brilliant campaigns in the rugged terrain of Armenia and the Caucasus. He was not focused on taking and holding cities, but on finding and destroying the Persian field armies. He drilled his troops relentlessly, turning them into a highly mobile and hardened force that could outmaneuver the larger, more ponderous Sassanian armies. He won a series of stunning victories, defeating the Persian forces that were sent against him and demonstrating to his own soldiers that the dreaded enemy could, in fact, be beaten. These campaigns were a masterclass in grand strategy, a slow but steady process of bleeding the Sassanian military, disrupting their command structure, and building the confidence and experience of his own elite troops, all while Khosrow II remained dismissive of the threat, viewing it as a minor distraction on a remote frontier. While Heraclius was chipping away at Sassanian power in the north, Khosrow II, still supremely confident in his ultimate victory and growing impatient with the lingering resistance from Constantinople, decided to make his final move to end the war. He ordered a grand coordinated assault on the Byzantine capital itself. In 626 CE, a massive Persian army under his best general, Sharbaraz, marched through Anatolia and once again encamped at Chalcedon on the Asian shore of the Bosphorus. Simultaneously, a colossal army of the Avars and their Slav vassals, who were allies of the Persians, swept down from the Balkans and laid siege to the city from the European side. It was the ultimate pincer movement, a combined force that vastly outnumbered the city's defenders, designed to crush the Byzantine capital between two mighty armies and finally decapitate the empire. This was to be the final, decisive battle of the long and brutal war. The siege of Constantinople in 626 CE was one of the most pivotal moments in history. The fate of Western civilization arguably hung in the balance. The city was defended by a small garrison of around 12,000 soldiers, but they were bolstered by the fanatical devotion of the civilian population, who were inspired by the charismatic and unyielding leadership of Patriarch Sergius. The city's greatest asset, however, was its legendary defenses, the Theodosian walls, a triple-layered system of fortifications that was the most formidable defensive structure in the ancient world. For centuries, these walls had repelled every foe, and they were about to face their greatest test. The key to the siege, however, lay not on the land, but in the waters of the Bosphorus. The Byzantine navy, with its superior ships and its control of the waterway, completely prevented the Persians from crossing and linking up with their Avar allies. Shah Baraz and his elite Sassanian army could only watch in frustration from the opposite shore, unable to bring their formidable siege expertise to bear. The Avars, despite launching massive and repeated assaults against the land walls, were unable to breach them. Their siege equipment was crude compared to that of the Persians, and every attack was repulsed with heavy losses by the disciplined defenders. The climax of the siege came when the Avars attempted a combined land and sea assault. Their fleet of primitive dugout canoes was annihilated by the Byzantine navy in the Golden Horn, and a final, desperate infantry assault was bloodily repulsed. Having suffered catastrophic losses and with their morale completely broken, the Avars abandoned the siege and retreated back into the Balkans, leaving their Persian allies stranded. On the other side of the Bosphorus, Shah Baraz could only watch the Avar camp burn. His elite army was useless, unable to participate in the battle. The failure to take Constantinople was a shattering blow to Sassanian prestige and a massive strategic defeat. The myth of their invincibility was broken, and the capital, the ultimate prize, had been denied to them. The psychological tide of the long war had finally and decisively turned. Heraclius's gamble had paid off beyond his wildest imaginings. The spectacular failure of the siege of Constantinople marked the beginning of the end for the Sassanian war effort and for the reign of Khosrow II. In a fit of rage and paranoia, unable to accept that his grand strategy had failed, Khosrow began to suspect his most capable general, Shah Baraz, of treason for his failure to take the city. He sent secret orders to a sub-commander in the Persian army to have the general executed. However, the messengers were intercepted by the Byzantines, who, in a brilliant move of psychological warfare, promptly showed the orders to Shah Baraz himself. The enraged general, realizing his king intended to murder him after years of loyal and victorious service, effectively declared neutrality. He withdrew his powerful and experienced army from the conflict, marching into northern Syria and refusing to obey any further orders from Ctesiphon. This single act of rebellion deprived the Sassanian state of its best commander and its most battle-hardened army at the most critical moment of the war. While the Sassanian command structure was fracturing from within, Heraclius was forging a powerful new alliance that would seal Persia's fate. He made contact with the Turkic tribes of the Caucasus, specifically the Western Gut Turks, a new and formidable nomadic power that had recently emerged from the Central Asian steppes. Promising them the vast plunder of the Persian heartland, he secured a formal alliance. His Byzantine army, already a hardened and experienced force, was now reinforced by tens of thousands of fierce Turkish horsemen, eager for battle and loot. With this massive combined force, Heraclius was ready to deliver the final, decisive blow. He would no longer be chipping away at the frontiers, he was going for the jugular. In the autumn of 627 CE, he launched a daring invasion of Mesopotamia, the very heartland of the Sassanian Empire. Khosrow II, seemingly paralyzed by his own arrogance and isolated in his opulent palaces, struggled to scrape together a new army to defend his homeland. The best troops were with Sharbaraz in Syria, and years of constant warfare had depleted his manpower. The new Persian army, led by the general Rahazad, finally confronted Heraclius's invasion force near the ruins of the ancient Assyrian capital of Nineveh. The Battle of Nineveh, fought in December of 627 CE, was the climatic showdown of the entire 26-year war. The Byzantine army, hardened by years of campaigning and bolstered by its Turkic allies, won a crushing and absolute victory. The Sassanian army was annihilated, and its commander, Rahazad, was reportedly killed in single combat by Emperor Heraclius himself. The victory at Nineveh was total and decisive. There were no more Sassanian armies left to defend the heartland. Heraclius was now free to march wherever he pleased. He advanced south towards the Sassanian capital of Ctesiphon, looting the grand palaces of Khosrow II at Dastagard along the way. The Persian king, the great conqueror who had come so close to extinguishing the Roman Empire, was now a fugitive, fleeing from his own capital in panic and disarray. This spectacular, unbelievable reversal of fortunes was the final straw for the Sassanian nobility. They had grown to despise Khosrow II for his tyranny, his bottomless arrogance, and his refusal to consider peace during the years of victory, a decision that had now led their empire to the brink of ruin. A conspiracy of disgruntled generals and nobles, led by Khosrow's own son, Kavad II, rose up against him. In early 628 CE, Khosrow II Parviz, the most victorious and ultimately the most disastrous of all the Sassanian kings, was overthrown, imprisoned in his own treasury, and after being forced to watch the execution of his favorite sons, was slowly and ignominiously put to death by archers. His fall was as swift and as brutal as his rise had been spectacular. The death of Khosrow II brought the Great War to an immediate and unceremonious end. His son, Kavad II, immediately sued for peace with Heraclius. The terms were a complete and utter Sassanian capitulation. Kavad agreed to withdraw all Persian forces from all conquered Byzantine territories, including Egypt, Syria, Palestine, Mesopotamia, and Armenia. He agreed to release all Roman prisoners of war and to pay a large war indemnity. And most importantly for the morale of the Christian world, he agreed to return the true cross. In 629 CE, Emperor Heraclius entered Constantinople in a magnificent triumph, the likes of which had not been seen in centuries. He rode into the city with the restored true cross held aloft, hailed not just as a Roman emperor, but as the savior of Christendom, a new Constantine, a new Alexander. The long apocalyptic war was finally over. The Roman Empire had survived. It had, against all odds, won. But it was a Pyrrhic victory of the highest order. Both empires, the victor and the vanquished, were left utterly and completely exhausted. Their treasuries were empty. Their manpower was catastrophically depleted. Their most productive provinces had been ravaged by decades of total war, and their societies were traumatized and dislocated. They had fought each other to a bloody, bitter, and absolute standstill, creating a geopolitical power vacuum in the heart of the Middle East. And into that vacuum, a new, unforeseen power was about to emerge from the deserts of Arabia, a power that would sweep away the old world and consign the epic, centuries-long struggle between Rome and Persia to the annals of history. The peace treaty signed by Kavad II marked not a new beginning for the Sassanian Empire, but the start of its terminal agony. the new king's first act was one of brutal, paranoid self-preservation, an act that would cripple the dynasty forever. To secure his throne from any potential rivals among his many siblings, he ordered the execution of all his brothers and half-brothers, effectively wiping out the entire male line of the House of Sassan. This act of dynastic slaughter, while securing his own short-term position, proved to be a catastrophic long-term blunder. It created a crisis of succession from which the empire would never recover, destroying the very principle of legitimate, orderly succession that had been a cornerstone of Sassanian stability. Kavad II's reign was destined to be short and disastrous. Just a few months after taking power and ending the war, he died of a devastating plague that was sweeping through the western provinces of the empire, a plague likely exacerbated by the constant movement of armies and the breakdown of sanitation during the Long War. His death in late 628 CE plunged the Sassanian state into a vortex of chaos and civil war. The centralized, autocratic system that had been perfected by Khosrow I and ruthlessly wielded by Khosrow II required a strong, undisputed monarch at its center. Without a clear and accepted heir, the entire state apparatus fractured. The empire's most powerful figures, the great regional nobles, the commanders of the various army factions, and powerful figures at the royal court began to fight amongst themselves for control of the crumbling state. In the 4 years that followed Kavad II's death, from 628 to 632 CE, the throne of Ctesiphon became a revolving door of pretenders and puppets. At least a dozen different rulers claimed the title of King of Kings, none of them able to establish any lasting authority. The most notable of these claimants were two daughters of Khosrow II, Purandokht and Azarmidokht, who reigned briefly, a testament to the sheer desperation and lack of viable male heirs. Even the great general Shah Baraz, the conqueror of Egypt, briefly seized the throne for himself, murdering the child king Ardashir III before he himself was assassinated just 40 days later. This period of intense internal strife was the death knell of the Sassanian Empire. The civil war was not just a political struggle, it was a complete societal collapse. The great professional army, the Savaran, which had been the bedrock of Sassanian power, disintegrated into private militias, loyal only to their own ambitious commanders. The intricate system of dams and irrigation canals in Mesopotamia, the economic heartland, fell into disrepair, leading to widespread famine and economic ruin. The tax collection system broke down, leaving the state with no revenue. The authority of the central government evaporated, and the empire effectively devolved into a collection of warring fiefdoms. The Sassanian Empire was now a hollowed-out shell, a magnificent tree rotted from the inside, waiting for a final push to topple it. It was at this moment of absolute, unprecedented weakness that the storm that had been gathering in the south finally broke. The Arab tribes of the Arabian Peninsula, recently unified by the new and dynamic faith of Islam, erupted onto the world stage. Driven by a potent combination of religious fervor, economic necessity, and a brilliant new form of mobile warfare, they began to launch raids into the southern territories of the Sassanian Empire. Initially, these were likely seen by the feuding Persian nobles as little more than a nuisance, another group of desert raiders to be dealt with once the more important business of the civil war was settled. They could not have been more wrong. These were not mere raids. They were the probing attacks of a disciplined, highly motivated, and strategically brilliant new superpower, and they were striking an empire that was already on its deathbed. The initial Arab incursions into southern Mesopotamia were met with a disorganized and feeble resistance from the fractured Sassanian military. Local garrisons were isolated and destroyed one by one. The Arab armies, under the command of brilliant tacticians like Khalid ibn al-Walid, moved with a speed and fluidity that the ponderous, heavy cavalry-based Sassanian forces found impossible to counter. They used the vast desert as an ocean, appearing suddenly to strike at vulnerable points before melting back into the sands where the heavily armored Persian armies could not follow. This new form of warfare, reliant on light cavalry, camels for logistics, and extreme mobility, was perfectly suited to the terrain and completely confounded the traditional Sassanian military doctrine. The Persian commanders, accustomed to set-piece battles and long sieges against the Byzantines, were strategically and tactically outmaneuvered at every turn. Their heavy cavalry was ineffective in the broken terrain and easily exhausted in pursuit of the elusive Arab raiders. Each local defeat further demoralized the Sassanian forces and emboldened the invaders, who began to transition from simple raids to a full-scale war of conquest, seizing territory and establishing permanent garrisons. The feuding Persian nobles, still preoccupied with their internal power struggles, failed to recognize the existential nature of the threat until it was far too late. They were unable to mount a coordinated, unified defense. Instead, each local magnate fought to defend his own lands, creating a patchwork of resistance that the Arabs could easily pick apart. The very structure of the late Sassanian state, which had become increasingly feudalized with power devolved to great noble houses, now proved to be a fatal weakness. There was no central command, no national strategy, only a series of desperate and disconnected last stands. The final, desperate attempt to restore order to the dying Persian state came in 632 CE with the coronation of Yazdegerd III, a young grandson of Khosrow II who had been hidden away during the years of chaos. He was the last king of the House of Sassan, a tragic, doomed figure who was destined to preside over the final dissolution of his 400-year-old ancestral empire. Ascending to the throne in the ancient Zoroastrian center of Istaka, far from the chaotic capital of Ctesiphon, Yazdegerd III represented the last hope of the traditionalist Persian aristocracy. He desperately tried to rally the feuding noble houses, to appeal to their sense of shared history and common danger, and to reconstitute the shattered imperial army. But it was far too little and far too late. The bonds of loyalty and the centralized structure that had held the empire together for 4 centuries had been irrevocably broken by the war with Byzantium and the subsequent civil war. The great nobles paid lip service to the new king, but they were primarily concerned with preserving their own power and their own lands. The Sassanian Empire was no longer a unified state. It was a loose, fractious confederation facing a unified, disciplined, and divinely inspired enemy. The decisive confrontation between the rising power of Islam and the dying empire of Persia would take place on the plains of Mesopotamia, the province the Sassanians called Dili Ranshar, the heart of Iran. The Arab armies of the Rashidun Caliphate, under the overall command of the Caliph Umar in Medina, were now engaged in a full-scale invasion, not just a series of raids. Yazdegerd III and his advisors knew that if Mesopotamia fell, the empire was finished. They gathered together all the remaining military strength of the empire, a final grand army drawn from every corner of the realm, a force that represented the last flowering of the Sassanian military tradition. At the head of this army was placed the most powerful noble in the empire, Rostam Farrokhzad, the military governor of Khorasan. The fate of the Sassanian world now rested on his shoulders. The Sassanian army that Rostam Farrokhzad led to confront the Arab invasion was, on paper, a formidable force. It vastly outnumbered the Muslim army, perhaps by a factor of 3 or 4 to 1. It was composed of the remnants of the elite Savaran heavy cavalry, large bodies of infantry, and, in a display of ancient Persian military tradition, a contingent of war elephants intended to terrorize the Arabian horses and break the enemy infantry lines. The army was a magnificent, glittering spectacle, a physical embodiment of the ancient power and glory of the King of Kings. But it was an army plagued by deep systemic weaknesses. Its leadership was divided, with the great nobles who commanded its various contingents jealous of one another's authority and of Rostam's supreme command. Its morale was low, shaken by years of civil war and the constant string of defeats that local garrisons had already suffered at the hands of the Arabs. And its tactics, based on the ponderous charge of heavy cavalry and the deployment of static infantry blocks, were outdated and ill-suited to counter the fluid, rapid-strike tactics of their opponents. On the other side, the Arab Muslim army led by Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas was everything the Sassanian army was not. It was smaller, more lightly equipped, and lacked the fearsome heavy cavalry and elephants of the Persians. But it was unified by a single, powerful faith that promised paradise to those who fell in battle. Its soldiers were hardy, accustomed to the harsh conditions of the desert, and utterly devoted to their commanders. And they were tactically brilliant, using their light cavalry and infantry in coordinated attacks, exploiting their superior mobility, and maintaining a level of discipline and cohesion that the fractious Persian host could no longer muster. The stage was set for the final, decisive battle that would determine the fate of Persia. In the year 636 CE, on a dusty plain near the town of Al-Qadisiyah, not far from the ancient ruins of Babylon, the two armies met. The battle that followed was not a swift, one-sided affair, but a brutal, grinding, multi-day struggle that raged for 3 days and 4 nights. It was a clash of two worlds, a struggle between an ancient, hierarchical, aristocratic empire and the young, dynamic, egalitarian faith. On the first day, the Sassanian war elephants proved devastatingly effective, panicking the Arab cavalry and threatening to break the Muslim lines. The Arab infantry, however, held firm, their discipline and courage preventing a rout. Over the next 2 days, the battle devolved into a savage series of charges and countercharges, a bloody stalemate in which both sides took heavy casualties. Rostam, directing the battle from a raised throne at the center of his army, threw his best units into the fray, confident that the sheer weight of his numbers would eventually prevail. The turning point of the battle, and indeed of the history of Persia, came on the 4th day. As the fighting reached its peak intensity, a massive sandstorm erupted, a common occurrence in the region. But this was no ordinary storm. The fierce winds blew directly from the west into the faces of the Sassanian soldiers, blinding them with dust and sand, tearing at their elaborate banners and disrupting their formations. For the Arab Muslims, with the wind at their backs, it was a miracle, a clear sign of divine intervention, the very hand of God striking down their enemies. In the chaos of the storm, the Arab forces launched an all-out assault. The Sassanian lines, already disoriented and demoralized by the wind, began to crumble. The climax of the battle, according to tradition, came when a small group of Arab warriors fought their way to the Sassanian command center. In the confusion, Rostam Farrokhzad, the commander-in-chief of the Persian army, was killed. The news of his death spread like wildfire through the Persian ranks, and what had been a wavering line collapsed into a full-scale, panicked rout. The defeat at Al-Qadisiyah was not just a lost battle, it was a mortal wound from which the Sassanian Empire would never recover. The main Sassanian field army, the last great hope of the dynasty, had been utterly annihilated. The rich province of Mesopotamia, the economic and administrative heart of the empire, now lay completely defenseless. The road to the capital, Ctesiphon, was wide open. The victorious Arab army advanced swiftly, brushing aside what little resistance remained. King Yazdegerd III, upon hearing the catastrophic news, gathered his court and the royal treasury and fled from his capital, heading east towards the relative safety of the Iranian plateau. He was abandoning the city that had been the heart of Sassanian power for over 400 years. Shortly thereafter, the Arab armies entered Ctesiphon. They were reportedly stunned by the sheer wealth and luxury of the city, by the grand arches of its palaces and the richness of its treasures. The capture of the Sassanian capital was a moment of immense symbolic and strategic importance. It signaled the end of an era. The heart of the empire had been ripped out. The house of Sassan, which had once ruled from the Nile to the Oxus, was now a dynasty in exile, its king a fugitive in his own collapsing realm. The fall of Ctesiphon was not the end of the war, but it was the end of the Sassanian Empire as a functioning superpower. From his refuge on the Iranian plateau, Yazdegerd III made one last desperate attempt to rally the remaining forces of his empire. He was able to gather a final grand army drawn from the eastern provinces that had not yet been touched by the Arab invasion and from the remnants of the forces that had escaped the disaster at Al-Qadisiyah. This was to be the final stand, a last gamble to drive the invaders out of the Mesopotamian heartland and restore the fortunes of the empire. The Sassanian High Command chose a strategic location in the Zagros Mountains, at a place called Nahavand, to make their stand. The mountainous terrain would, they hoped, negate the superior mobility of the Arab cavalry and give their own heavy infantry a defensive advantage. Here, in 642 CE, the final major battle between the Rashidun Caliphates and the Sassanian Empire took place. The Battle of Nahavand was, if anything, an even more catastrophic defeat for the Persians than Al-Qadisiyah had been. The Arab commanders, using a clever feigned retreat, lured the Sassanian army out of its strong defensive positions and onto the open plain. Once the Persians were drawn into the trap, the main Arab army turned and attacked, completely surrounding and annihilating the Sassanian force. The defeat at Nahavand was the final, irreversible blow. The Arab sources would later refer to it as the Fatah al-Fuchi, the victory of victories, because it completely and utterly destroyed the last vestiges of organized Sassanian military power. The Iranian plateau, the very homeland of the Sassanian dynasty, now lay open and defenseless. The Sassanian Empire, as a political and military entity, had ceased to exist. What followed was not a swift conquest, but a slow, piecemeal process of subjugation that would last for several decades. The Arab armies fanned out across the vast Iranian plateau, conquering it province by province, city by city. Many cities and regions put up fierce local resistance, led by members of the old Sassanian nobility, the Deccans, who fought to preserve their lands, their power, and their ancient faith. But this resistance was uncoordinated and localized. Without a central army or a unifying king to lead them, they were eventually overcome one by one. The story of the Sassanian Empire's final decade is the story of its last king, Yazdegerd III. His life became a desperate, decade-long flight from the advancing Arab armies. He fled from one city to another, from Ray to Isfahan, from Istakhar to Kerman, and finally to the remote northeastern province of Khorasan, the very edge of his former empire. He was a king with no army, no treasury, and no kingdom, a tragic figure desperately trying to rally support for a cause that was already lost. He sent desperate embassies to the Tang Emperor of China, pleading for military assistance to reclaim his throne, but the aid never